Texas President Mirabeau Lamar felt the best approach to Mexico was a carrot and stick method backed up by his new fleet. In February 1839, Lamar sent envoy Barnard Bee to Mexico to negotiate Texas recognition from the central government, which was then hard-pressed by General Antonio Canales' Federalist revolt in the north. The government, however, refused to allow Bee to set foot on Mexican soil. In November, as the Texas fleet was concentrating in Galveston, Lamar made a second attempt, dispatching James Treat, a citizen of Texas. This time, Mexico accepted the delegate, but the talks were doomed by Texas' insistence upon the Rio Grande as the border between the two countries, its push to run its southwestern border from El Paso to California, and the political climate under President Bustamante, which had hardened against recognition. As talks dragged on for months with no signs of progress, Lamar and Secretary of State Abner Lipscomb concluded that Mexico's negotiation with Treat were simply a ruse to keep the Texas Navy off the Mexican coast until Mexico could rebuild its forces. President Lamar decided that the time was right to back Treat and treat the Mexicans with what Theodore Roosevelt would later call the big stick. On June 3, 1840, President Lamar and his suite paid their respects to the flagship Austin, which saluted the president with 22 guns. 2 days later, Secretary Lipscomb paid a similar visit and was received with 17 guns. The timing of these visits was not coincidental. Lamar was preparing orders to terminate Treat's negotiations within 10 days, unless Mexico City agreed to recognize Texas. By this time, Lamar had instructed Commodore Moore to begin preparations in earnest for a cruise along the Mexican coast and to determine the order of battle for the Texas fleet that would accompany him. It was high tide for the Texas Navy, and as the fleet prepared to set forth to sea, its commander looked every inch the mighty captain that he was. The fleet sailed north from the mouth of the Mississippi, beginning on July 22nd, Zavala leading the way. To the rural citizens of the poor frontier republic, the pride and treasure of Texas were about to sail onto the world stage in a terrific show of force. There were certainly larger fleets on the seas, and there were more advanced ones. But the 5 men of war that set forth under the command of Edwin Ward Moore that day represented the very best the young, bankrupt Republic of Texas could offer. A half-century before Roosevelt's Great White Fleet and Britain's HMS Dreadnought, the flotilla that Commodore Moore led into the Gulf represented the hopes and aspirations of the young republic and the idealistic and warlike president who led her. And that is from Lone Star Navy, Texas in the Fight for the Gulf of Mexico and the Shaping of the American West by Jonathan Jordan, 2007. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I'm joined by Joshua Treviño, the foundation's chief of intelligence and research. Thank you, Josh, for reading that passage. Do you want to jump into why you chose it for today's episode?
Yeah, no, thank you. A couple of big reasons. One is that it's always exciting to read about the Texas Navy. For spoilers, and people should read Jordan's book, Lone Star Navy. But for spoilers, what ends up happening is that this flotilla that gets led out by Commodore Moore actually ends up facing a British crewed Mexican hired fleet off of Campeche. And the Texas fleet ends up controlling for a brief time access to the Atlantic approaches to Mexico, which is an extraordinary feat for Texas. And at the Battle of Campeche, they actually fight these, mostly Royal Navy veterans, British Royal Navy veterans, in superior vessels to a draw. I believe it's the only time in history that sail-powered wooden ships defeat steam-powered, I believe, iron-hulled ships. I don't think they were true ironclads. I think it was iron sheeting over the wooden structure of the vessels. But an amazing sort of underdog victory for the Texans at sea that ends up resulting in the exact strategic aim for which Mirabeau Lamar set them forth, which was a strategic diversion to Mexico. Mexico, of course, at the time was riddled with division, secessionist conspiracies. There was the Republic of the Rio Grande that was briefly referenced in the passage. The attempted secession of the Yucatan actually ended up being about 70 years worth of war. It wasn't really wrapped up till the end of the Porfiriato in the early 20th century. And so this effort by Texas to invest in a naval force and to achieve what they could never have achieved by force majeure on land, which was actually the strategic destabilization of Mexico, their principal foreign threat, is an amazing story. And it ties directly into a lot of the issues that we face today when we too need to think very comprehensively about strategy at the national level and our goals. Of course, our aim today is the opposite of the Republic of Texas. We don't want to destabilize Mexico. We want to stabilize it and unify it, to the extent that we're able to lend our good offices to that. But nevertheless, that quality of thought needs to exist. It doesn't really in Washington, D.C. right now. The idea that power needs to be backed by hard force is seeping back into consciousness, but not fast enough. And so that's why I think this passage is interesting.
No, that's awesome. And on that note, since we're talking about strategy, let's use that to segue into Mexico. How do you think our strategy is going towards Mexico?
I don't think we have a strategy toward Mexico.
I agree.
You're talking about Washington, D.C. I think Texas is emerging with one, but it's just incredibly clear at this point that the Biden regime has no real strategy except to beg the Mexican state for relief from proximate and tactical level crises that they think threaten their own political prospects within the United States. But a sense of stewardship of the nation or a desired end state almost completely absent from policymaking.
Right. And we as a state shouldn't have to have a strategy against Mexico, but we're compelled to, right?
Here we are. Yes, a return to the original concept of the republic, though, in which the states are far more sovereign than not.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I do want to talk about Biden begging Mexico for help. But first, I want to talk to you about something that probably a lot of people missed. On December 28th, when none of us were paying attention, the White House issued this joint communique with Mexico that has created, I think, some tension between the two countries, because the American version released it citing democratic decline as one of the reasons for heavy and irregular migration.
Right.
And then Mexico released their version, and it didn't include that phrase.
Right.
So what ended up happening is the U.S. immediately corrected it, removed the phrase, and then came out and said that it was a mistake, and they called it like a version control issue, right?
Right.
And so,
that's one way
first
to
of all,
put it.
yeah, that's one way to put it. But
Yeah.
first of all, this is really weird because usually those like joint communiques are like very negotiated and looked at in depth before they are released, right? But in this case, I guess they had some sort of miscommunication. But what I found really fascinating is how quick the Biden administration or the White House was to like correct that error. And it just made me think, like, I want to get your thoughts on this. Are they just like trying to mask authoritarianism? Clearly they know, as many of us do, that democratic decline is a reason for some heavy migration. We've seen it with Venezuela. We've seen it with a lot of countries.
Mm-hmm.
But Biden administration is showing us that they're very quick to bow down to other corrupt and anti-democratic regimes because they're like we just saw it in this example, right?
Right.
So I'm just curious, do you think that Biden is like scared of getting on Mexico's bad side? Like, what do you have to say about all this?
Back in summer 2023, so a million years ago, TPPF CEO Greg Sindelar actually had an op-ed in the Federalist. We'll include a link in the show
I'll
notes
make sure
here.
to link it.
In which he explicitly predicted that AMLO in the Mexican state would use a migration crisis to essentially blackmail Joe Biden and the regime in Washington, D.C. as the 2024 elections approached. And that is exactly what is happening. That prediction has been 100% vindicated. It didn't take, I wouldn't say it took a ton of insight, for us to perceive that. But, the fact that we were one of the few to do it, I think really speaks to the absence of expertise in the field. There's certainly nobody in Washington, D.C. who predicted it coming. Now we're seeing it fulfilled. 2024 is upon us. What happened at the end of December was that the U.S. Secretary of State actually went to Mexico City, essentially to ask the Mexicans to please turn off the spigot as far as human trafficking goes. Several million. I think 2023, I believe, was the largest year ever for illegal migration to the United States. And we have to understand what the numbers are. Given the apprehensions being themselves a fraction of encounters, the encounters themselves being a minority fraction. Again, we've said this before, but the rule of thumb is that you encounter only about 20% of those who try to enter. So
tiny.
I mean, you end up with an annualized figure of anywhere between 5 to 15 million individuals who illegally entered the United States and are now probably going to stay there. meet your new neighbors, right? I mean, who knows where they're from? Who knows what their agenda is? But and who knows who the networks are that traffic them here, except that they're all criminal. So there's an awareness driven in no small part by the complaints of Democratic big city mayors up north that this is a threat to the reelection of the president in 2024. So the Secretary of State goes down, and the Mexicans have their price tag for it. Sure, we can cut it off, which they can. They could cut it off at any time if they chose to, but they choose not to for two reasons. One, they know it's huge leverage against the United States. And the other, as we've discussed many times in the show, is that they themselves profit from the trafficking networks and the criminal cartels that run this massive migration of millions, plus the remittances that then come back to Mexico and Latin America as a consequence. So the price tag exacted by the Mexicans that we know about was this. We know that the Mexicans asked the federal government to shut down Texas' attempts to control the border. Texas has had two major efforts. One has been the erection of physical barriers outside Eagle Pass. We talked about that in a previous show. Federal personnel have since been, litigating against the barriers, removing them. The Mexicans have said, and I believe AMLO himself said at one of his mañaneras, that was done at Mexican state request. So that's one episode. Another episode came with this meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and Mexican officialdom. Probably the usual suspects there at SRE. But announcing, immediately after, I think it was literally the day after. I'll have to double check that. That after this communique, the federal government announced it was suing Texas, litigating against Texas SB 4 from the 88th regular Texas legislative session.
It might have even been the same day.
Might have been the same day. Yeah, it was certainly within 24 hours, right? And so clearly the two are linked. The Mexicans want to shut down Texas. Now, all this begs a question, of course, if the Biden regime is so concerned about the effects of illegal migration and they're begging the Mexicans to stop it, why don't they just work with Texas? Because Texas can stop it. I mean, Texas actually has the operational capacity and certainly the political willpower to do it. But the reason that they don't, and the reason that they cooperate with a foreign government at the expense of an American state, a large American state, is because they don't feel a sense of stewardship or responsibility to the citizens of Texas, to the people of Texas. They just don't. Washington, D.C., writ large, simply does not care what happens to Texas. And so that's something that's a hard political reality that we need to understand. And so that's one part of the price tag is that the Mexicans insist that Washington, D.C. make war on Texas, which for political purposes, Washington, D.C. is only happy to do. Their other price tag was, I believe it was $20 billion to be invested, which I'll put in quotes, in when you look at the details, it's a phony reforestation scheme for Central America. It's going to be a massive graft opportunity for all the recipients involved.
To help with poverty, right?
To help with poverty,
That's what they said, when we know it's going to feed corruption.
We'll dump billions into some of the most corrupt societies and governments on earth, and there is a case for foreign aid, by the way, but it's certainly not this. It's not $20 billion at the behest of the Mexican state, which is going to 1,000% squander every penny it gets. So it's $20 billion invested in that. They insisted upon, and now AMLO has claimed that this was actually agreed to. I mean,
I
who
saw
knows?
that,
He did. He went to the mañanera and he said, we extracted a lifting of the U.S. Sanctions on Cuba, a lifting of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. which has kind of already been done in a way. There was something else. And then legalization
the 10 million.
of 10 million illegals in the United States. And according to AMLO at his mañanera, the Americans agreed to all this. Who knows if it's true, right? I mean, AMLO himself's not super trustworthy. I don't know, though. You say you don't think so, and you may be right. I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right, too.
But I don't trust, honestly, based on experience, I don't trust that the Biden team didn't agree to it and said, you know what, we'll slow walk it. We've got to roll it out on our own time, but we will do these things. And AMLO just may have jumped the gun by announcing it publicly. It wouldn't be unprecedented, in full candor, for something like that to happen.
Yeah. I mean, we've already seen Biden lift some of the sanctions on Venezuela. And
we have.
We've seen the Maduro regime do nothing about it. They still haven't arranged for free elections. And
they won't.
And then they won't. They haven't lifted the prohibition on the other candidates' presidency. And then also we're seeing, this is so weird, but we're seeing the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Have you seen this? They're like promoting tourism and they're co-hosting public concerts when we know that that's a regime that has like at least 1,000 political prisoners in dungeons.
Absolutely.
So, clearly the Biden administration, there's a precedent for this.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're you're totally right. And it is a weird confluence of ideological proclivities on the parts of the progressives who rule in Washington, D.C., because they genuinely empathize with the Nicaraguans and the Cubans. If I haven't, I think I might have told this story before on the podcast, so I'll keep it very, very brief. But, kind of as an illumination of the mindset of these people, we actually had meetings in Mexico with some good folks who did good work, by the way. These were migration lawyers, Americans, who did their best to help migrants who get caught in human trafficking networks. And so, yeah, I share the story by way of saying, like, I have tremendous respect for the work that these folks do. But their ideological priors, which are 1,000% typical of the individuals who dominate, for example, the State Department or academia in the United States, were just so far left and so off the empirical base as to be ready for exploit by people like AMLO. And what they said to us is that after we'd had this very interesting meeting, which we actually concurred on a lot of items of analysis, we were cautioned. I'll paraphrase here, but it's an accurate paraphrase. Hey, you need to understand that the United States caused all this. When you look at criminality in Mexico, or you look at the state cartel synthesis, or you look at governments that feel no sense of obligation toward their own citizenry and therefore keep them mired in poverty, it's because the United States has such a robust record of intervention going back for 200 years that Latin America has never been able to coalesce. And you kind of listen to it and you say, yeah, okay, thanks for your views on this. But they sincerely believe it. And so when you have this mindset that we are the font of original sin, like if you sincerely believe that, then if you are a State Department official and you're going to negotiate with SRE in Mexico or any Latin American office holder, what's your reflex? Your reflex is to say, oh my gosh, how can we turn over a new leaf? How can we, the United States, finally acquiesce to you? And look, you grew up in Bolivia. Like, what are they going to do? They're going to take advantage of that impetus, right? I mean, it's not going to be a good faith exchange. Certainly not from the Mexican governmental side. And that's just it's incredible. Close with this because I don't want to filibuster the whole show. It's absolutely incredible. And again, you have to respect the Mexican state officials for this, for understanding it so well, for understanding the mindset so well. When you look at the objective correlation of forces, any negotiation between Mexico and the United States holds all the cards. We've said this time and time and time again. We hold all the cards. Economically, fiscally, in terms of resources, military power, if it comes to that, analytically, there's nothing where we don't hold an upper hand. And so, in a sense, it could be a dictation of terms, especially when the Mexican state is acting in bad faith. I wouldn't advocate for that as a perpetual state. But when you have a bad faith actor like AMLO and the Moreno regime, you should think about that.
Yeah.
None of those advantages matter because of this self-abnegation and self-flagellation on the part of the Biden regime personnel who actually negotiate with Mexico, who see it as their duty to find out how they can placate the power and the regime in Mexico City to the benefit of that regime. And whatever you wish to call it, you cannot call it governance on behalf of the American people.
No, absolutely not. Just like you said, it's ironic, the Biden administration begging Mexico for help to stop the illegal flow of immigrants into the U.S., while on the other hand suing Texas that is trying to do that exact same thing.
Yeah.
So like you said, there's no point in holding all the cards if we are not going to use them. Especially.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, this is beyond me, but Biden has to know that Mexico has no intention of stopping that flow. Like that's what's beyond me. Like, even if AMLO and Mexico wanted to, they can't because the cartels are making too much money out of it, and they have got to know that. Or like, are they just delusional, or is this just some sort of farce that they want to put up that they're trying to do something about the border right before the election because they can see that it's affecting the poll numbers? I guess I'm just is it ignorance?
Well, I mean, I think there's multiple questions in there. I mean, one thing I think is about I think, and I think people of goodwill disagree on this. I actually think the Mexican state could stop the migration flow like that if it chose to. Sedena, the army, which is let's be honest, riddled with traffickers itself, and is highly corrupt, is still the single most powerful force within Mexico, just from a force majeure standpoint. And if they chose to, they could do what they did in 2018-19 and shut down the illegal crossings. The flow right now is not forced upon the Mexican state. The Mexican state has chosen to acquiesce to it, but it could end it if it wished. So I think that's part one. Part two is I won't speculate on what the president himself, the president of the United States, does or doesn't know, but I wouldn't place heavy bets on the robustness of his cognition in any circumstance at this point. Even when he was in his prime, whenever that was, probably I don't think you were born, at that point. But even when he was in prime, President Biden has been his entire public career infamous for getting things badly wrong in the foreign policy sphere. Yeah. Just badly infamous. So add this to the mix. But the third thing, and I think it's worth illuminating here is you have to look as always at the ideological roots of what we see. And on the U.S. side, the American left, and I think the Western progressive left in general, has talked itself into a position where there is no moral vindication for stopping migration of any kind, legal, illegal, whatever, for any purpose. That to move is intrinsically virtuous, and the way that they've talked themselves into this, which I would argue is an unmooring from kind of the traditional left going back, because it used to be. I say it used to be. I'm feeling my age here when I say this, but I'm of an age where I can remember a left that actually was in many cases very concerned with a politics of place, of preserving the nature of particular communities, of making these communities better, of really rooting itself in say your particular Rust Belt town, your particular Southern town, or whatever. And so there wasn't until I'd say the past generation, at least in the United States, I can't speak for Europe, a real division of sentiment toward place and people and the ideology of the left. Now in Latin America, they're still very tightly bound together. Look at AMLO himself; he's a leftist, but he's very into indigenismo and that politics. So they've still got that. They've still got the union. Here it's just completely gone. And so when you have that, it's impossible to make an argument to somebody in Washington, D.C., some gray bureaucrat who, graduates from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and says, let's say we as a Texan come up to them and say, we really like to keep Texas, Texas. We're a very open state. We're a very welcoming state. We have, I think, the fastest growing Asian population in the United States. We're 40%, Hispanic, so on. But at the same time, we want to know who's coming in, and we don't want to be swamped by millions of people whom we don't know, period. To them, that's a morally illegitimate argument. You can't proceed from the basis of arguing for the preservation of the polity or the community or anything like that, because those things simply don't have intrinsic value. And there's a line to be drawn from, this is a little bit external to the ambit of the show, but there's a line to be drawn from the desire to, for example, destroy monuments. They just removed a statue of William Penn. The famous Confederate William Penn has been removed from an NPS property in Philadelphia in the past week, which is I don't even know on what grounds. Apparently, it wasn't inclusive enough. But if a Quaker who establishes a colony for toleration is not good enough, who is? But we've seen it with Penn, with Jefferson, with Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and so on. That erasure of history is hand in glove in U.S. political culture with this belief that there is no legitimate grounds for opposing migration of any kind in any circumstance, and that is. The twin destruction of both the past and the present is the end of the nation, taken to its logical extreme.
Wow. I thought we were over that phase of destroying statues, but I guess we're not.
No, it will. There was kind of a spasm of it in 2020.
Like a huge one,
it's been rolling, like the modern era kicked off in 2015. And it's been rolling, and 2020 really intensified it, but it's still going on. Yeah. Like those people are still out there, and the work of erasing American history, is for them, it's not over.
Yeah, and it's happening more quietly now. I feel like it's not getting a lot of attention.
It's been institutionalized. I think that's probably the right way to put it. Okay. Yeah.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. I know we have a lot to cover. Let's talk about what's happening in Ecuador. I know that you have seen a lot of videos, you've seen a lot of articles, and our listeners probably have too, but they are dealing with this horrifying wave of violence, including murders, including kidnapping. You've seen videos of cars being torched. there's like inmates, including drug lords and gang leaders escaping from prison. One of those actually is Ecuador's most wanted criminal. No big deal.
Yeah.
And there's, prison guards being taken hostage and killed.
Executed, yeah.
Yeah, I saw this horrifying video. There's videos of all this stuff, by the way. And then, we've seen also videos of like armed men on the street. They're stopping traffic. I believe businesses and schools and offices in Ecuador are closed in the major cities.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that a lot of people have probably seen this week, just because it's such a shocking video, is the live broadcast of this TV station that was on air on Tuesday in Guayaquil, when it was stormed and taken over by 13 gunmen with explosives, dynamites, these long-range guns. This is all on video, by the way.
Yeah.
This was broadcasted live for at least 20 minutes before the media employees were rescued. And so that's one thing that seems like out of a bad movie, And then I guess police later arrived. They rescued the employees, but thankfully nobody was killed, by the way. But a cameraman got shot, and then someone got their arm broken. And so all of this stuff that's just happening, this prompted the new president, Daniel Noboa, who just took office. He just took office in November, but he ran on fighting this drug-related violence, right? But this prompted him to declare a state of emergency for 60 days.
That's right.
Which seems, a state of emergency. But I think I told you this yesterday, but I looked into it, and the last administration, the last president did that 22 times.
Who was the last president? Was it Correa? Was he the last president, or was there one intervening? So well, it's two of us.
There was one. Yeah, I'll link it or something.
We apologize to the hard country listenership. We don't know the previous Ecuadorian president. So please go ahead.
I might think of it because I looked into him a lot yesterday. I just can't remember right now. But he declared a state of emergency 22 times with no result.
Yeah.
So that's very discouraging. But the current president, Noboa, he also decided that he would name 22, I think, or 24 of these gangs terrorist organizations, which I found very fascinating.
That's very interesting.
But what a lot of people don't know, again, is that this violence is not new. In 2022, which lifetime ago, Ecuador became one of the top 10 most violent countries in like Latin America and Central America, Caribbean.
Yeah.
And in 2023, they had their bloodiest year ever, and they are now in that top 3.
Yeah.
I think they might still be counting the numbers, but it looks like they're going to be in the top 3 most violent countries.
And you and I discussed back in the fall the execution of one of the presidential candidates in Mexico who was running on an anti-cartel platform at the time. And we believe the Choneros killed him at the behest of the Mexican Sinaloans.
Because they're linked somehow. And actually, the leader of the Choneros is the one that recently escaped from prison. I think they call him Fito. Jose Adolfo Macias Villamar, and he is still at large.
Okay.
It's huge state of emergency because nobody knows where he is.
It's a state of war throughout the country is what Noboa said.
Yeah, it's terrible. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I also want to compare it to what's happening in Mexico. Obviously, like Mexico has long also been plagued by this narco terrorism and all of this violence. And naturally, AMLO felt compelled to comment on what's going on in Ecuador.
Of course.
And he came out to talk about it, sent his support for the current president and called all of the violence going on. He called it vandalistic attitudes.
Yes.
Which is absolutely amazing. And then
that's quite a description for light infantry actions in the middle of your capital city.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Well, and I thought it was interesting because the current president of Ecuador is doing, I think, exactly what AMLO has done exactly the opposite of what AMLO has done in Mexico. But they seem to be friends, like they seem to support one another, which I think is very interesting. But the president of Ecuador has completely declared a war on these gangs and these cartels. Like, he has not hesitated to say that they're terrorist organizations. There's a lot of violence in the streets because they're trying so hard to fight them. Whereas AMLO has this, of course, we know, like his hugs, not bullets policy.
Right.
And so I just thought that was fascinating, one. And then 2, I guess back in September, the U.S. and Ecuador reached some sort of agreement where Ecuador agreed to intervention. Did you know that? There was
I hadn't heard the Intervención, but they've had like some kind of military cooperation going on for a while now. But what are the details?
Yeah, and Ecuador is asking for help. Well, last September, there's pictures. The last president came and met in Washington, D.C. with a lot of lawmakers. I think some of them were the House Cartel Task Force, which you testified in front of.
Okay.
I didn't know this. Apparently, it was done very quietly. But they struck a deal that would allow the U.S., in case that it was needed, to send military forces to Ecuador by land and also off the coast. So, like I said, I think it was done very quietly, and I don't think that the State Department made any of the agreements public, but I read an article on it, which I will link, and it was confirmed that there's the status of forces agreements, which would allow members of our military to go into Ecuador. And then there was a maritime law enforcement agreement. And it was confirmed that this was signed, right? But the second agreement would allow military vessels from the U.S. to be present in those waters off of the northwestern coast.
The status of force, I speak without having researched this, but one of the kind of the constant phenomena when stuff like this is signed, there's typically a SOFA, like a status of forces agreement, when there's going to be any kind of like a rotational presence through any third country. So like the host country will have a status of forces agreement to cover kind of legal status of American forces there, what they can and can't do. But it's usually a lot more benign than people think. Like if it's a training mission or something like that, like, hey, whose jurisdiction does it fall under? What's the cap on the number of people there? So I guess I would have to see it.
Oh, that's good background. I didn't know that.
I would be very surprised. I'm not saying it's wrong. I would be very surprised if Ecuador had agreed to allow the United States to police Ecuador. It would be...
Yeah,
it would be interesting.
That would be interesting.
But I doubt it. Anyway, sorry. So please go on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I just found it fascinating because I think that regardless, like Ecuador has asked the U.S. for help, and I was looking this up, and in December, Ecuador said back then that it was expecting to seal a deal with the U.S. To get like security equipment and support so that they could fight these gangs and fight these cartels. And at the time, they said it was going to be $200 million. In December, again, when a lot of us weren't paying attention.
Sure.
But yesterday, I saw an article saying that Ecuador's president had just announced that he received a pledge of aid from the U.S. To help contain all the terror that's going on in Ecuador. I'm not sure how much it is. I don't think it's yet been announced. We'll update the listeners. But reading this was very fascinating to me because I don't think that this is something that Mexico would ever do. They are just so defensive of their sovereignty. They're so opposed to like the U.S. helping fight the terror in Mexico in any way. So I just found the contrast interesting.
It is, and I mean the purposes and the details, right? Which again, in full candor, I don't know on this one. Ecuador is the Ecuadorian state has been playing footsie with some pretty malign forces for a long time, and obviously, Presidente Noboa is new, so he doesn't bear any particular responsibility for it. But the Ecuadorians, under Correa, which I guess was 2 administrations ago, maybe 3.
I think so.
Sent Ecuador lurching into this very leftward direction, and Ecuador ended up hosting a variety of Colombian guerrilla groups. There was like a scandal's probably not the right word, but there was a diplomatic confrontation between Colombia and Ecuador about a decade or so back. I don't remember the exact year in which the Colombians actually killed the Colombian guerrilla commander, like a wanted man, on Ecuadorian soil. And so the Colombians claim they didn't know, but they did, and they just chose to do it because the Ecuadorian state was consciously hosting these individuals. And so, unfortunately, the people of Ecuador are now reaping the consequences of the Ecuadorian state's decision to accommodate and engage with this array of leftist guerrilla forces, which are indistinguishable from criminal cartels at this point. And so what you're seeing now let's call it what it is, small-scale civil war at this point. It could become a big one. It's part of a process that we've already seen unfold elsewhere. We've seen it, and it doesn't map one to one, but we've seen it in a different sense in Mexico. We've seen it in a different sense in Honduras. We've seen it in a different sense in Guatemala. Now it's on. We've seen it in Venezuela. So it's just metastasizing region-wide, right? You see it even in Jamaica, which is an English-speaking, former British colony. So it's a civic disease. Haiti as well.
Yeah.
It's a civic disease. It's affecting the entire region. This is another consequence, in my view, of the United States' failure to exercise strategic hegemony over the region. State breakdown shouldn't be happening in Latin America at this point, but it has been now really since, depending on where you want to count it, and set aside the case of Haiti, which I think is a special case. But it has been happening for the past 20 years or so. And there's never been any kind of a strategic response to it. There's never been this kind of realization that the United States, set aside the interest, but I think this is also true of the interest of like the individual citizen of any country in Latin America, requires strong sovereign states, throughout the region, states that actually exercise effective control over their citizenry, their population, and their borders. And that's been allowed to go by the wayside. So when you look at what's happening in Ecuador, and you look particularly at Daniel Noboa's declaration of war and the state of emergency, which is definitely not going to end in 60 days, and the use of the armed forces, there's two pathways for him, right? Actually, yeah, no, there's two pathways for him. It can either be the Mexico 2006 pathway, in which Felipe Calderon also called in Sedena, called in the army and the armed forces against the cartels, and it plunges the nation into decades of intermittent and sanguinary warfare for the rest, which is exactly what's happened to Mexico. That's one pathway. Another pathway, plausible pathway, I'm not saying these are the only two, but I'd say these are the plausible ones, is what seems to be happening in El Salvador with Nayib Bukele, who has locked up. Do you remember what the proportion is? Like 5% of all. The proportion of El Salvadorians behind bars is staggering. Like it's a huge proportion. It's like 2, 3, 5%, something like that. But I read, again, I can't speak from firsthand experience. We probably need to go at some point and just see it, because it's interesting. El Salvador, in sort of the American movement conservative mentality, is kind of assuming a place in the firmament akin to where Hungary reposes in the minds of a lot of our DC friends, which is like, this is the small country that's done it right. I don't know if El Salvador has done it right or not, but I do know that they've gone all in on militarization, mass incarceration, and supposedly El Salvador is safer than it's ever been, which, if true, great.
Yeah.
And that's clearly, Noboa himself has praised Bukele before. I wonder if that's what he's going for. Now, to do that requires a tremendous amount of organization, and it requires an armed forces that you can trust. And I don't know enough about Ecuador to say whether that's there or not, but it really, really bears watching, because what's happening in Ecuador can easily happen in almost every other country of the continent. I mean, tell me if you disagree with that. If I had to think through, probably not Brazil, probably not like the big three: Brazil, Argentina, Chile. But you could see it given a sufficient push in a Peru or a Colombia, or actually, I'll ask you your own specific area of expertise. How vulnerable would Bolivia be to a series of events like this, given sufficiently bad government, which Bolivia has had? Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's terrifying, first of all, to think of, but we've never been close to that. I know there was like a lot of civil unrest with the elections in 2019.
Right.
This is a long time from there, and I think this takes a long time to build up, right?
Sure.
What's happening in Ecuador has been happening for a very long time.
Yes.
But like you said, I don't think any country is immune to it.
Yeah.
And I do think I've seen statements about how Noboa is planning to do something very similar to what's happened, to what Bukele did, to what happened in El Salvador. So
okay,
we will see. In fact, I saw that he is going to involve like the armed forces in fighting cartels. I don't know if you saw that. And
it's part of his declaration. Yeah,
it's one of his plans. But I saw an article that kind of made me chuckle a little bit in El Financiero yesterday. And it was titled, Ecuador quiere aplicar la receta AMLO y pedirá que militares puedan combatir el crimen. And that to me was kind of funny, because I was like, where are people getting this impression that AMLO is like actually trying to fight the cartels? but
I'm sure AMLO loves being linked with militarization of the anti-cartel strategy.
Right?
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I thought that was funny.
Yeah.
But so since we're speaking of Mexico, we can go back to that before we close. But I just found it sad because what's happening in Ecuador is like truly heartbreaking. But it's been happening right here.
It has.
Like our neighbors are going through it in Mexico, and there's so much violence there just this week, and I think last week too. I'll tell you about some of the terrible stories that I've seen really quick. I'll summarize them.
Okay.
But 30 people were killed in Chiapas because of a clash between the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartels. 5 medical students were found dead inside a vehicle with signs of torture. 4 bystanders were shot while they were at a hair salon. 11 people were killed by criminals at a holiday party. 9 bodies were recently found in San Juan del Rio in Querétaro in the trunks of 2 vehicles.
In Querétaro.
Yeah, I'm going there in like 2 weeks.
Good heavens.
But this late last week, there was this drug cartel. I don't know if you've seen these videos that attacked this remote community in Guerrero.
Oh, this is the drone attack.
The drone attack,
Yes,
yeah, with
please.
drones
Yes.
and with gunmen.
Yes.
And it's believed that at least 30 people were killed. And what's really sad is this hasn't been confirmed because authorities have not been able to go into this area.
Oh, yeah.
It's this remote area.
Yeah.
But it's believed that these people, it's the Elidoro Castillo community, were just caught in this like escalating war that's happening between La Familia Michoacana and the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
Just imagine the sophistication of the cartels mounting a drone attack that kills 30 people.
30 people.
In a small community. I mean, that's Ukrainian front stuff.
And this is the same community where back in October, a police chief and 13 other policemen were ambushed and killed. So it's not uncommon. It's not like a newsflash story. We're going back and forth between all of these terrible cases. We can't even keep up with how many horrible things are happening in Mexico. And I just think it's not any different than what's happening in Ecuador, but we see AMLO in his mañanera just showing so much pity, right, for Ecuador, and sending this hope for peace to be reestablished in their country, where like
Sure. What
does
about
he
his?
not realize? Yeah, does he not realize what's happening in his, and not just the violence, but less than 4% of these criminal investigations that we have in Mexico are ever solved.
That operational sophistication, how long does it take to drive to Guerrero? It's about 11 hours, right?
I think so.
I think so. I mean, assuming that you did not have narco checkpoints. So we're not recommending to our viewers to drive to Guerrero. I just want to be really clear. But I don't know, 11 hours maybe? I would need to map it out. So it's Beaumont to El Paso. You could drive there. So just imagine that within driving distance of your home, you've got these personnel who have benefited from, take your pick, operational expertise that's indigenous, from within Mexico, from Hezbollah trainers, from Wagner Group trainers, from the array of Middle Eastern contacts that we know that the cartels have. And they're building drone swarms that, conduct a massacre. The drones in a small town, as they continue to lose respect for and fear of the United States, the chances rise asymptotically, I think, that comes here.
And, I'll end with this, but people are getting really sick of it. They're starting to take matters into their own hands. I don't know if you saw. Yeah, Mexicans are.
Please. Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw this story, but this month there was this story, and there's a video too. There's partly a video, but there was these campesinos, these farmers in central Mexico. They were just fed up, and they unleashed all of their fury on these gang members that came into their land and tried to extort them. Did you see this story?
I saw the news story. I don't know if there was...
Yeah. They used rifles and they used machetes to chase down and kill, and they did kill 10 members of this local cell of the Michoacan family cartel. And so some of it was caught on video again, but people in social media that were seeing this video and these reports were like celebrating it, right? Because it's this story about these regular citizens that triumphed over their oppressors, right? But, it's just really sad. Like, I started thinking about it, and the fact that they had to do that and take matters into their own hands because they have a government that's derelict
Right.
kind of like we are, right?
Yeah.
In Texas,
Yeah,
there's a
some
lot
ways.
of
Yeah.
similarities there. I think that's more of a tragedy than a victory, that they can't count on their authorities to protect them.
These autodefensas, these local self-defense groups have been around for several years now in places like Michoacan and Guerrero and elsewhere in Mexico. And it seems like, I'll overgeneralize a little bit, but one of three things happens to them, or really one of two things happens to them. They either become criminal organizations themselves, because then they become the power holders that are local, and link up with one of the rival major cartels. Very common. Or we saw this, I believe, in Michoacan 7 or 8 years ago. David Ogren, by the way, did the key reporting on this. The federal government rolls in and suppresses them on behalf of the cartels with whom they work. So I don't applaud what could possibly be described as a lynching, right? Because I haven't seen the video or anything like that. But at the same time, we should be aware that the history of these in Mexico is not a happy one, and that even if they succeed and are wholly virtuous, the state will crush them down, and that too is part of the tragedy of Mexico.
Well, we'll see what happens. I know we have a presidential election coming up, not just in the U.S., but in Mexico. And it seems like the one coming up in Mexico, there's a single issue that people are voting on, and that's security.
I hope that's the case. Do we know that? Do we have evidence that that's the case, that they're voting on security? Or because security's always been in previous Mexican elections, it's there, but it's never the surpassing issue that one might think.
I think at this point, like, violence has become so huge that a lot of people are voting on security.
Okay.
And what they can do against the drug cartels, but I have to look up polling on it.
Yeah, we'd have to get some data.
But I keep hearing that, so
I don't want to end the show without putting you on the spot a little bit, Melissa. We had a robust conversation over the past 24 hours of popular music in Latin America, which apparently I know nothing about, which is fine. I'm happy to know nothing about it. But who's big right now? What are the young people listening to?
Okay, I'll tell you.
Go ahead.
Peso Pluma is huge right now. Do you know who that is?
I have no idea who Peso Pluma is.
I'll tell you, at least in like Latin America.
Tell me.
So he's from Mexico. He's from Sinaloa.
Oh, he's from Sinaloa.
And
okay.
I believe,
is he a narco corrido guy? Is that his?
Actually, you should look it up. I believe there's ties.
Of course. Okay, please.
Yeah. But I was telling Josh at the beginning, for our listeners that weren't here, we were talking about how big corridos have gotten everywhere.
Mexican style corridos.
Yeah. Just in the last year, maybe even less, maybe like in the past 8 to 10 months, Mexican style corridos have become huge. Everyone's listening to them. All the artists that were doing like reggaeton and other kinds of musics are now like they're shifting a little bit towards the corridos, rancheros.
What's driving that?
I have no idea.
Is it because it's associated with like the very alluring like criminal lifestyle? And
no, because that's always been the case.
It's always been the case. Yeah, well, reggaeton benefited from that too, actually. But no, it's just so Mexican cultural dominance is having a moment. Is that right?
Yeah, I think part of it was like the big artists started doing like a couple of collaborations. So Bad Bunny did his collaboration with Grupo Frontera. They did this song that everyone started listening to, and then Peso Pluma became huge, and he only does like corridos.
Where's Bad Bunny from?
He's from Puerto Rico.
He's from Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think that like people started listening to that, and they were like, where can we get more? So now like everyone, I was telling you, even like people that normally do reggaeton, like Maluma, Karol G, they're doing this style of music because it's so big.
And you were going to be at a Karol G concert in Mexico shortly. That's amazing. It's just a whole group of artists. I mean, I personally know nothing about. I will continue to know very little about, honestly, but I am interested in the fact that the corrido has become...
It's become huge.
Big.
The first time I heard my husband, David, listening to it, I was like, turn that off. What are you doing? Because it's just like, it's so rare. It's not the kind of music that we used to listen to.
And just for the listeners, he's Bolivian also.
Yeah, Bolivian. Yes, right, and I was like, what are you listening to? And it was Peso Pluma, who at the time wasn't so famous. The third time I heard it, I was like, turn it up.
Okay.
Yeah, so now it's become... I found it fascinating because, as you know, like I was in Bolivia for New Year, I was in Bolivia for Christmas, and when we would go out, that's like all we would hear.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a shift happening.
So as I shared with you, I feel mildly proud that I discovered Shakira before she came to the United States, out from found her in Nicaragua, actually, back when she was just a Colombian artist.
Before she was huge.
I want to state for the record, though, to all the listeners, I'm not really a fan of Shakira's English language, like post big work. But Donde Están las Ladronas? Great album. Great album, early one. But all which say, so is she like she must be like an elder stateswoman now.
Shakira?
I mean, that was 25 years ago, right?
No, she's still huge.
She's still gigantic?
She's still huge.
Interesting.
Yeah, people still like eat up everything that she puts out. And she has been putting out really good music recently.
Okay, so you're a fan.
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
She will always be the best.
Well, you heard it here.
In every stage.
Let me just put in a plug for the Chilean Ana Tijoux and her 2014 album Vengo, which is fantastic. Anyway, the listeners can judge who has better taste, but it's probably Melissa. Thanks for the show.
Thank you, Josh. That was a good episode. And thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next time.